It wasn't that long ago that the price of an electric vehicle was the biggest constraining factor for adoption. And then that changed to range and access to charging infrastructure. Well, a new study from IDTechX suggests that in only a few years, that's not going to be much of an issue because we're going to have much longer range electric vehicles, maybe even 1,000-mile vehicle by 2030. So I'm going to talk to Dr. Peter Harrop about his study, and welcome to the interview, Peter.
Hello, glad to be with you.
Well, look, why don't we start off with an overview, please?
Yes, okay. There's a strange sort of history of sort of human behavior where I've tracked the thing for decades, and years ago, the manufacturers were sort of saying, well, these electric vehicles can go the average distance that you would go in a city, and why are people so stupid? They won't buy them. But in reality, range has been an issue right through, and it still is. And clearly other things are an issue as well, given that you haven't got the range you want. You're concerned about charging stations and all sorts of other things that can cover for that. But at best, that's a necessary evil. Most people live in cities. There's a move to cities. More people are going to live in cities. Most of them live in apartments like I do, where here in London, I can't have a charging station, nor can most people in apartments. So you have to use one in the street if you can find one, and it may or may not be blocked. The one that I see outside the window here is blocked because they're doing filming, would you believe? But one way or another, it's at best a necessary evil. And leaving a car overnight, it can get vandalized in a public place and so on. So range has always been an issue. Of course, price has been an issue. There's been a big penalty in price to buy something reasonably equivalent to an internal combustion engine. But now we're in the world of carrot and stick, aren't we? So increasingly, here in London, for instance, there's a lot of trouble being deliberately put on people who have internal combustion vehicles. That's carrot and stick, and they're restricted or banned or whatever. So it's a bit of a continuum, and it is rather curious to look at it, because even today, quite a lot of people say, well, I don't really need long range, and yet, if you don't listen to what they're saying and look at what they're doing, they've been over the years buying gasoline vehicles, and they haven't complained that the range is 1,000 miles. I'd like to have a cheaper one that can barely do the distance. They take it as a given, and we're going to come to the world of taking it as a given, but it won't be 1,000 miles in 2030. It'll take a little bit longer, but the fastest progress towards that is going to happen in the short term. And certainly in a very few years, manufacturers that don't at least have quite a few vehicles that can do 600 miles are going to be looked at rather like people trying to sell a car with no sound system and no air conditioning. Like, you know, there are some out there, but you virtually have to give them away. So that is our take on it. But the good news is that there are a very large number of things that can increase the range of the vehicle so it no longer becomes an issue. And it's not as commonly portrayed waiting for the super battery. In fact, the so-called solid state batteries are actually going to take rather longer, we think, than is portrayed. So that's a quick take.
So the issue here, Dr. Harrop, is not just that you need 1,000-kilometer range, say, to get, because you have to travel that day to visit Granny or something, and you want to do it all. You need that kind of range. It's also because people don't have access to chargers, and so maybe they only want to charge up every 2 weeks or a month. So fair game on that. how do we get there? Now, you mentioned batteries, so batteries are going to improve a fair amount, but then there are other strategies as well, I understand, like making the vehicles lighter and making them simpler.
Well, yes, that's right. We can see best practice in some different car companies already. Of course we can, and it's no accident that the leaders like Tesla have some of the longest range vehicles, and that they've got there by grunt work, doing lots of little things. They've got rid of a kilometre of cable. That can be heavy and it takes space. And you may say, oh, well, that's only a few percent with range, but it all adds up. In fact, it doesn't add up, it multiplies. If you get 20% improvement in range from one thing and 20% from another, you actually get 44% increase in range, because as you can imagine, the job gets easier when you've, whatever you've done, made the car lighter weight and all those good things. So it's actually a sort of iterative process where Tesla's done a superb job of making the motors more efficient. They use less electricity, so can use it for more range. They've done a very good job of making the car have much better drag factor. They're not the best now, but they're among the best. And obviously, if it slips through the air easily, that's a great thing. Simplification is just massive opportunity for simplification. Absolutely.
Could you explain that in more detail? Because that's simplifying an electric car. I already think of an electric car as much simpler than an internal combustion engine car. But you're saying that even electric cars can be made more simple. Could you explain that? I'm very curious.
Yes, sure. Let's take some examples. It's sort of paradoxical in a way. If you have motors in the wheels, you might say, well, that's not simpler. You've got 4 motors instead of 1. But actually, you get rid of the differential, you get rid of the axles, you get rid of some gearing, you get rid of a lot of cabling, and you do end up, on balance, eliminating a lot of components and making the thing far simpler. Something else you can do, all these things can be done together. These aren't alternatives, you can do one and another and all of them. Second one is that there's something called in-mold electronics. It's where you don't put components wired together in a box. We've been doing that for 200 years, time for a change. You basically print a lot of your electronic and electrical components and you thump them out in a lump of plastic. So you've really got just one part, nothing to go wrong. You spray it with a hose and it'll still work. And that can, so far the evidence is that can replace up to 100 components, capacitors, resistors, and all the interconnecting plugs and all sorts of things. So 100 becomes 1, that's got to be good. And Tesla's taken the lead in doing enormous die castings, which is rather funny, really, because if you buy a little miniature Tesla as a toy for your child that you hold in your hand, it's made by die casting. But they're doing it on a grand scale now in the car itself. So when you do these enormous die castings, some of which can include the battery, one of the main ones they're about to do is saving 370 components become one. So you can do all of these things, and I could carry on, but these are heroic, massive improvements which have many benefits that improve range. They make the vehicle look more lightweight, they make it waste less electricity, and so on.
Now, Dr. Harrop, I ventured an opinion during an interview with another expert about electric vehicles and batteries, and the opinion was that the rapid advancement we've seen in the last, say 3 years has a lot to do with the fact that the automakers and some of the startups around batteries had poured tremendous resources into engineering. Much of the science was done, and now it was about engineering to make it work in the real world. That expert agreed, but I'd be interested in your take on that, and because that suggests that the kind of advances that you're talking about, that's how we'll get them, is we've now got the engineering resources to solve these problems.
Yes, I think it is mainly engineering rather than totally new physics, but a lot of it is transferring success from other areas. There are things called heat pumps that some people have in their houses and so on, because it can work a bit like a refrigerator going backwards. You can move heat to where you want it or cold to where you want it. Nissan pioneered use of heat pumps in electric vehicles. Tesla's now finally using them and they're leapfrogging with a more advanced heat pump. So it's not new physics, but it's coming from areas where they were used before the car industry did. Some cars are using things called supercapacitors, which have been used widely elsewhere, and they obviously do help sometimes to make the battery last longer and all sorts of good things. So there's a lot of benchmarking and transporting across new technologies. For instance, on your house, you might have crystalline silicon solar panels, and if you haven't got a very big house, you might want more bang for your buck by having so-called single crystal silicon, which is the sort of quality product. And it doesn't necessarily cost much more now because you don't need as much of it. It produces more electricity per unit area. Well, that's now moved to vehicles. It happened, first of all, for instance, in Australia, these students herring across the nation just on sunshine in something more like a skateboard with one person in the middle. You can't sell those on the open market, but now several companies, and now the big people joining the show, Tesla, Hyundai, are doing solar bodywork, not a pathetic solar square on the surface, but often the sides as well. And they're using single crystal silicon, but they're doing it, sort of merging it with the technology of vehicles. For instance, your headlights, you can hit them with a sledgehammer because they're made of what's called polycarbonate. And so the leading one with the solar cars, with the big orders, is a startup in Germany. They've got orders for over 10,000 cars that never plug in if you're gentle with them. And this particular company, Sono Motors, is sandwiching in polycarbonate, because you can hit it with a sledgehammer, the silicon solar cells, which are sort of glass-like and delicate, and making them into the body itself. So different parts of the vehicle clipping together, and you end up a bit like they said, Henry Ford said, which is you can have a car any color as long as it's black, because in fact, black is what sucks in the sun best. But there are others, like here in the Netherlands and so on, startups doing very advanced solar cars. And as I say, the big boys are rapidly joining the party, because this is rather nice, because it not only means that if you're gentle with the car, you never plug in. If you do a modest amount of distance, you know, my wife here in London only does 11,000 kilometers a year. My sales director in Tokyo, he only does about 11,000 kilometers a year. And unless he accelerates wildly or tries to tow something heavy, he could have, both of them could have solar cars already. So that coming in is a benefit. But in most applications, it's not energy independence, it's just helping to get a very long range, okay?
Well, Dr. Harrop, maybe we can wrap up the interview with a review of the ranges that you're anticipating and when they might appear in vehicles. So my take on this now is that the average range seems to be around 400 kilometers, maybe 500 kilometers. And when are we going to start seeing, 750 kilometers per charge or 1,000 kilometers per charge?
It's one thing for some technical person to demonstrate one. I mean, we already have solar racers that cross Australia 2,500 kilometers or more. It's another thing to say, well, if I compromise massively, there's an Aptra, a three-wheeler car that's only 2-seat, and they claim they can do 1,000 miles, not 1,000 kilometers, they can do 1,600 kilometers, they claim, but it's not been verified and it's not under a recognized test cycle of how real people behave. So we have to be slightly cautious about those claims. So if we come to the proper test cycles that try to reflect how you and I behave, and we talk about cars generally on sale, not in exhibitions or something, then we're going to have 1,000-mile cars. It's detailed in our report, but I won't go beyond saying within only a few years. And they will be initially in the premium models, obviously. And so 750 to 1,000 kilometers is only a few years away for many manufacturers for their premium models. And then that will trickle down. And by 2030, it is quite likely to be the norm for almost everything. So we'll be in that world where, although we've got a run on fairly short range cars in London here now, for instance, because of all the benefits you get of free parking and all the rest, and saving on the tax and so on, and getting subsidies, we've got to run on those. But it's going to go in sort of two phases. Those people, they can't afford a longer range one, but they will find that the second-hand price is more like 20% of the purchase price after 3 years instead of 60%. They will find that if they're towing something on a cold day, or think of other things, got lots of passengers in, or when the car is a bit worn out after a few years, they will find that they've got quite often half the range they thought they had bought. And as these people learn this and the longer range cars become more affordable, you'll get a runaway. So you get a runaway where people will try really hard to get that longer range. And it's not particularly because they think once a year they're going a long distance on holiday. That's not why you buy a 1,600 kilometer petrol car. It's because why not? Okay.
Great.
But it does cover for the bad. With electric vehicles, they do have this weakness, unlike a gasoline vehicle, that they, under certain conditions, have terrible range. You think you've got good range and you haven't. But another aspect is that, for instance, with the solar bodywork, that's a get you home feature. That's really cool. So if you do tour Uzbekistan or Australia or something and you get caught in the wrong place, you just have to wait and talk to a passing goat for a few hours and you will get enough electricity from the sunshine to get somewhere. It's a get you home feature. So people are going to start realizing all these things. And because of increasing in simplification, efficiency, in lightweighting, regeneration of heat in the vehicle, the solar bodywork, reduced drag factor, working around all those goodies with a fabulous tick list of things that can happen, it's going to progress very fast over the next few years. And then the later bit, getting to 1,600 kilometers, that could take another 10 years, certainly well past 2030. It's easy to begin with, but after that it gets more difficult, but they'll certainly work on it. Oh, yes.
Well, Dr. Harrop, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Glad to help.